Copenhagen and Obama are responsible for the fact that we don't have a legally binding treaty. Paris was a bubble. And I happened to be present and I watched for the first time things changed. Till that time, heads of state used to represent their countries. In Paris is the first time Mr. Gates was on the stage with the heads of state. And I said something has shifted. Power has shifted. From governments, it has moved to unelected billionaires.
Hello and welcome. Today we have a very special guest with us, Vandana Shiva. Vandana is an Indian scholar, environmental activist, food sovereignty advocate, ecofeminist, and an anti-globalisation author. Vandana has written more than 20 books. She is often referred to as Gandhi of Green for her activism associated with the anti-GMO movement. Vandana, welcome to India and Global Left.
Hello.
Okay, so before we jump into the more substantive questions, can you tell our viewers a little bit about how and why you went on to switch your career from, that in physics to the commitment towards environmental activism?
Well, I of course did my PhD in the foundations of quantum theory on a topic called hidden variables and non-locality in quantum theory, becomes more relevant every day. But I had got involved as a volunteer with the Chipko movement in the early 70s, even before going to Canada for my PhD. And so my two paths kind of worked together. But then I wanted to understand that the dominant view was the more science and technology you have, the less poverty you have. But everywhere I saw that if big trawlers came, the fishermen lost their livelihoods and there was more poverty. When the Green Revolution came, there was new poverty. So I said the dominant narrative doesn't make any sense. And I'd done a few studies with the Indian Institute of Science to understand this link between science and society. And then I realized that it would be important to be independent. And I created the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology, which tried to bring together my work in science policy, my understanding of the quantum world, and my involvement with ecological activism. So from the 70s onwards, I have done this work, yeah.
Okay, so can I start with your thoughts on the recently concluded COP27 climate summit at Sharm el-Sheikh?
Well, having lived through the whole process of the birth of these international environmental treaties, including the UN framework on climate change, as well as the biodiversity convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity. I think a lot of people don't realize that ever since the UN framework was created, it had very clear legally binding rules. That's something people have totally forgotten, because the dismantling of the legally binding rules is being treated as a celebration by a lot of the people in the West and environmentalists who don't either understand global issues.
Under the Kyoto Protocol.
No, so Kyoto Protocol, it didn't involve us, because we were not among the polluters in the early stages. The Kyoto Protocol, of course, did not bring down emissions. It increased the emissions. So quite clearly, any kind of emissions trading should have been pushed aside after the failure of Kyoto to actually regulate. But most people don't realize that Obama, who is celebrated as a very progressive president, was the one who came to Copenhagen at the Copenhagen summit and in front of our eyes dismantled the legally binding treaty. A law is a law when it's legally binding. If it's just words, it's no more legally binding. So he sat with the top polluters by then, because India and China, which had not been historic polluters, but were made polluters through the calculated globalization of outsourcing of pollution. So the pollution of the West was now counted as our pollution or the China's pollution. It was, even though it was still the global corporations who were responsible. the Obama sat with 5 polluters and said, why do we have to have legally binding systems? Because they were already putting pressure on China and India. And he, in a way, thought that he could get them involved to say no legally binding pressures, we just have voluntary commitments. He killed the UN treaty. Copenhagen and Obama are responsible for the fact that we don't have a legally binding treaty, and the original polluters, whose historic pollution is the root of the problem, and the original treaty said polluters must pay. The two principles that came out of Rio was precautionary principle, and the second was polluters must pay. We know the polluters are 1% are responsible for more. And now those are the very people who are now trying to create new pseudo solutions, new greenwashing, in order to make more money, control every aspect of life. Bill Gates is running around all of the African continent speaking rubbish, saying for billions of years we've had GMOs. I've always been eating GMO bread, GMO wheat bread. Wait, there's no GMO wheat outside Argentina. And that too is 1 year old. So a man who can lie through, she can just lie. How can we treat a liar as the scientific leader of the world? We've already got into deep problems with him. And I think the big tragedy is the billionaires can do anything they want, speak any rubbish they want, and there's no accountability system. That's what the global regime is all about. The dismantling of the power of sovereignty, appropriating the rights of national countries that got independence through, fighting colonialism. Globalization was recolonization, as Chakravarti Raghavan wrote. Yeah, we went right back to where we were in the colonial days, and then to have, the governments of the South play a role for the globalization itself. We were resistors through the 90s and early 2000s. We were resistors. And now, basically, because of the way the global regime has spread its tentacles, what we are seeing is a dismantling of regulation, which was always the intention, and an increasing in investor rights and corporate rights. And you can't have an asymmetry of that kind. You can't have those who pollute, those who exploit, those who extract, have no rules to regulate them, and super policing of ordinary citizens. This is a system that must collapse. If not today, it will collapse tomorrow. Ecologically, it will collapse. Socially and politically, it will collapse.
Just to clarify, what you are saying is that it's not just President Trump who, momentarily took United States away from the climate agreement, but it's also Obama.
Well, there was no climate agreement legally binding. It was just voluntary commitments.
Yeah,
so he said, we will not play a voluntary game. He said that, and he walked away from it.
And the Paris Agreement became non-binding.
Paris was a bubble. Paris was a bubble. And I happened to be present, and I watched, for the first time, things changed. Till that time, heads of state used to represent their countries. In Paris is the first time Mr. Gates was on the stage with the heads of state. And I said something has shifted. Power has shifted. From governments, it has moved to unelected billionaires. And they are telling governments what to do. That's why I wrote the book, Oneness versus 1%, which is available in India from Women Unlimited and in the US from Chelsea Green. If you notice now, Mr. Klaus Schwab and Mr. Gates have been at the G20. So they're shaping all the agendas until we learn to focus on the billionaires and the corporations they control and create a politics directed at them, and that'll have to be a global movement, as it was when we created the International Forum on Globalization, and I was on the founding board. We were able to organize and shut down the World Trade Organization in Seattle. We know there's been militarization, and there's been an attempt to not allow organizing, not allow protests, but we will have to find new ways of collectively, internationally organizing. Of the movements on the ground are very strong, because it's a life and death issue for them. If you're going to anyway die because your land was robbed, your forest was destroyed, your river was destroyed, you might as well fight, So the people of the grassroots are very clear. it's the international understanding that gets weaker and more diluted and more polarized.
Right. I think this is a great moment to enter the Navdanya movement, the seed protection movement, even though like it's a much larger framework of not just seed sovereignty, but food security, sustainable agriculture. But let's just take up the seed sovereignty part and your long history of struggle against corporation, famously Monsanto, against patent of seed. And can you tell us a little bit about that, heroic struggle against the biggest corporation?
Well, the Monsantos of the world weren't in India because we were a sovereign country. We had thrown the corporations out. When we became independent, we nationalized oil, we nationalized banks, and we really grew up as a sovereign, economically sovereign nation. I was forced to look at agriculture, not my field. As you know, physics and quantum theory was my background. But I'd studied in Punjab. I'd done my MSc honors in particle physics in Punjab University. And 84, violence erupted in Punjab. And the narrative was always, it's about religion. But I'd been following conflicts for the United Nations University. I was doing a 5-year program for them. And I had lots and lots of documentation on river conflicts, on the issues of water in Punjab. And I've been keeping track of the fact that farmers were angry. So I did the study for the United Nations University, which is called The Violence of the Green Revolution. And that educated me about the role of corporations using war technologies that were developed in Hitler's Germany, because even though the armies were allied on the one side and Hitler on the other, the reality was the corporations of America and the corporations of Germany were working together to make the chemicals to kill people initially. And after the wars, they said, why shut down these factories? Let's turn these into agri-chemicals. So I had become very familiar about the illusions of industrial agriculture, that it's basically a war technology. And because of this, I was invited to meeting on biotechnology, where the industry was there, and they said, now we have to make more money than what we make by just selling chemicals. We have to own the seed. But to own the seed, we must do genetic engineering, because then we can claim we've made something new and take a patent on it. So at this first meeting, it was clear genetic engineering was for patenting. There was no commercial GMO at that time in 87. So patents and ownership of seed was the issue. The result is clear before us. 60% of the seeds are in the hands of 4 corporations. The same 4 that was in Hitler's Germany are now controlling all the seed of the world, buying up local companies, buying up, and basically just threatening them legal cases. So Monsanto entered India 98 illegally. And the arrogance is what allows me to be in this field. They put full-page ads that next year Indian farmers will be buying Bolgard cotton. But because I'd been following the biotechnology field, I knew Bolgard had failed in America, and I knew Bolgard was a trade name of Monsanto. There was no name of Monsanto. But I knew Bolgard was their property right. So I immediately asked the Ministry of Environment, I asked Agriculture Ministry, did they take your approval? And they said, no, we don't know more Monsanto. We don't know who they are. We don't know what BT cotton is. No one came to us. So I filed a case that winter, which was, I think, admitted in the Supreme Court in January of 99. Basically showing that Monsanto had entered India illegally, violating all the rules and all the laws. I also had the government involved. I said, you're supposed to be regulating and protecting the Indian people. You're sleeping. So that case then went on, and Monsanto could not commercialize. They wanted to commercialize next year, and they couldn't commercialize. And a lot of data came out in the process on the BT cotton itself. So 2002, it's very interesting because this whole GMO field is so crooked. In March of 2001, the government found BT cotton in Gujarat and ordered its uprooting. It said it's toxic, its roots are toxic, it'll ruin the soil forever, it must be uprooted. A week later, that same committee that had ordered uprooting said it's totally safe. and gave approval to Monsanto. Of course, we know that basically the BT cotton has totally failed. And right now the big issue is the GMO mustard, which now Bayer has bought Monsanto. So it's still a Bayer Monsanto technology. Why did I get involved with Monsanto? I'd seen what they've done around the world. I was just like, I've tracked the climate discussions from when the climate treaty was born. I've tracked the biotech performance from the beginning of when GMOs were created. And I have used the laws, part of which I've played a role in shaping the International Biosafety Protocol, the Cartagena Protocol, and the Indian laws which predate it. And we've used our laws and our constitution and our sovereignty to not allow a corrupt corporation to totally override us, pollute and destroy our seeds. If in one crop, all our cotton can be destroyed. And of the 400,000 farmers' suicides, 85% are in the cotton belt. All that evidence is there. It doesn't increase yields. It increases pesticide and fertilizer use. It increases farmers' debt. It has led to an epidemic of them. So, I don't believe in having knowledge and not speaking about it, So I have talked, every time I have found Monsanto's crookedness and Bayer's crookedness, I have talked and I've used what little ability I have to organize movements to challenge the wrongness, because how can war criminals be ruling agriculture in the world? It is wrong.
Right. You mentioned about the rhetoric of food security, and right now the issue is going on the GM mustard, and I guess the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee has cleared the use of GMO for open farming. And the argument is that India is a huge importer of oilseeds, and this would relieve the sort of input burden. So can you just talk a little bit about the debate about food security in general, because we are told that sustainable agriculture, organic farming, and so on cannot feed 7.5 billion.
Okay, this argument has been used to introduce the Green Revolution. It's been used to push industrial agriculture and GMOs. The argument is false because they measure the wrong thing. What is measured is yield of a monoculture. The yield of a monoculture is not the productivity of a farm. A productivity is output per unit input. How much output did you get? All products. And how much input did you use? So you do the simple mathematics. If you take a biodiverse field with 9 crops, as Navdanya means 9 seeds, 9 crops, its productivity biologically, it's much higher than if I grew only 1 crop, no matter what the yield of that 1 crop. A biodiverse system has higher biodiverse productivity. Now, if you don't measure the biodiverse productivity and only measure the yield of a commodity that leaves the farm, you're not measuring farm productivity. You are measuring a tradable commodity transfer. It's a very different issue. It's not a biological measurement. Yeah, you can't trade of a commodity as if that's what the ecosystem is giving. Yeah, so it's a false measure. And I realized that when I did the Green Revolution study. And since then, I've been measuring biodiverse productivity. And we've said, okay, we'll take biodiversity rather than monocultures. All biodiverse systems produce more. We said we'll convert it into nutrition, which is what feeds people. And nutrition per acre, which is an indicator we've evolved in place of yield per acre. If we were biodiverse and sustainable, as in Navdanya's farmers are, we could provide good, healthy nutrition to 2 times India's population. Because nutrition is what feeds people. Commodities don't feed people. Commodities feed profits of agribusiness. So coming to the particular issue of GM mustard, they claim that this will relieve the import burden. People need to know, why are we importing? We were 97% self-sufficient in 1997. 97% edible oil self-sufficient. And on mustard, even now we are 100% self-sufficient. The amount of mustard we need in the country, we are growing it. We don't import mustard. We are substituting other crops. We are substituting other crops like sesame and linseed and all, which were everyone's use. So on it, a trade dumping issue can't be turned into a technology issue. In '98, the soya lobby wanting to grab the Indian market, and they were writing essay after essay those days, India's the El Dorado of soya, because we can displace the pulses and make analog pulses with soya, you know, the moong dal with a yellow, with a green coating, urad dal with a black coating. They were imagining that. And of course, edible oils we can substitute. Because pressure, when these corporations work, they of course work through their governments, but they also corrupt our governments. Because that's what lobbying is about. What is lobbying? Corrupt a government. By then the lobbies were around. And India, which had put the bound duties in WTO at 300%, at 300%, nothing would have come into India because our oilseeds were cheaper. But the US was subsidizing exports to $190 a ton. And that's what allowed the dumping, and India had reduced the tariffs to zero. The combination of reducing tariffs from 300% to 0% and the US giving subsidies is what allowed the flooding. So if that's what allowed the flooding, you correct it at that point. You bring back the 300% duty and you ensure that the WTO rules that don't allow subsidies, which have never ever been followed, those should be applied. They shouldn't be put in the green box and the blue box, etc. The second is the yield question is also false. And, you know, the biggest institute for mustard research is in Bharatpur, the Directorate of Mustard Research. And their research has shown that good Indian varieties that exist have about 4,000 kilograms per hectare production. The GM mustard is 1,200 in truth, a little exaggerated, maybe 2,600, with totally cooked up data. So if Indian varieties produce 4,000, why are you going for a lowering production? And adding toxic strains, you know, it has Barnes, Basta, which is all in the hands. Those patents are in the hand of buyer. And ownership of seed is decided by who has the patent. You know, Monsanto used its patents in America to destroy our cotton seed industry. You know, everyone's a marketing agent now of Monsanto. They collect royalties, 8,000 crores they've transferred from India. So, it is not going to, we don't need more mustard. As I said, we are self-sufficient. But even, I mean, you can't force a Keralite to eat mustard oil. You know, you're crazy if you don't understand that you can't force a Punjabi to eat coconut oil, and you can't force a Keralite to eat mustard oil. The respect for the diversity of this country is vital in agriculture. But the most important point is, you know, they'll bring one variety, but they brought one BT cotton and they've destroyed all our cotton. There used to be 1,500 varieties of cotton. They'll bring one GM mustard, but the contamination will absolutely destroy our mustard. And I don't know if you know that the US has just threatened India again, because we have a GMO-free export status. You know, if you export, you must be GMO-free. And that's because of the international trade system. The Europeans want GMO-free. They're saying you remove that status because it's interfering in our exports to you of rice. Why should India be importing rice from the United States? We are a rice culture. Akshat, you know, 200,000 varieties of rice this society has evolved. That culture had no rice. They were rice, they were corn, they're beans, you know, the First Nations. So every argument is a fraudulent argument. It's like Bill Gates saying for how billions of years he's been eating GMO meat. You know, sadly, the GMO question is so full of rubbish, and it's only the power of corruption and lobbying that has allowed constantly this thing to even suffice. Now, by now, we should have wrapped it up and said, BT cotton failed. Why should we play with GMO mustard? Contaminate our most precious oil, which is also a healing oil. It's Ayurvedic oil, you know. And if it's full of Barnes, this, you know, antibiotic resistance marker, cauliflower mosaic virus, none of which have been tested. None of it have been tested. So what's always, you know, whether it was the Chipko movement or all the movements for me, the first trigger is always destruction justified by a falsehood. The combination of two is lethal.
Right. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the whole behavioral change that is probably needed to think about environment as a sort of, not something which is an alienated outside factor, but, we as living entities being part of that. And this is particularly relevant to us who are living in urban spaces, who are so alienated that we sometimes look, I mean, not sometimes, mostly we look at the environment as, and with kind of consumerism and private property notion as it is like a dumping ground. So can you tell us a little bit about how can we be more sort of, because you are like, as I understand, you are more rooted with the environment and you have your own farms and things like that. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. For me, ecology is the science of relationships. And my quantum understanding is the science of relationships. Non-locality means everything's related. You can't separate. So to be a truly ecological person, you have to see how what you do, how your consumption is related to the earth. I don't use the word environment, as you've noticed. I use the word the living earth, yeah? How the oxygen you breathe comes from the trees. How the water you drink comes from the hydrological cycle. How the food you eat comes from the nutrition cycle. And therefore, we are connected in our very lives. These are basic things that keep us alive. So a conscious citizen will always connect, and say, what is my consumption costing the earth? If I'm using chemical food, I'm killing the rivers. I'm contributing to climate change, and nitrous oxide is 300 times more damaging than carbon dioxide. You start asking those questions. Then you shift to ecological food, not because of it as a market phenomena. You shift to it because it's good for your body, it's good for the earth. You shift to it as an ecological duty. And my work has been always, I explain to the farmers what the chemicals are doing. I show them what earthworms suffer when the urea is applied. And they shift. As long as they're in the market mode, they can't shift. Because all the rhetoric makes them think the more they get into debt, the richer they're getting. It totally kills their ability to think. But when you shift them to the ethical ecological position, they think of what's the right way to relate to the earth. And then they want to do the good farming. And for an urban person, what's the right way to eat in ways that helps the earth. So the ecological links all the way, and at least with food you can begin.
Right. I mean, talking about the living entity and the whole ethical part, I was wondering, like, since this is like a left platform, I was wondering, like, if environment, particularly, the kind of things works that you do can allow us to insert or engage with spirituality in any ways with the whole sort of our left movement, anti-cooperation, equality and so on. Because, I mean, if you look at the labor oriented left movement, it generally sort of shies away from things like spirituality and so there is a big void. I mean, not everywhere. I mean, you can think about the liberation theology in Latin America and so on, but more in general, the Western left is sort of shy. I mean, it shies from bringing spirituality. So can you tell us a little bit about that, if there is any space within that?
Well, I think, and those who took up a reductionist way of looking at the world. What did Descartes say? Descartes said, I'm a thinking mind without a body. I'm a thinking thing without a body. Yeah. The Cartesian logic is the body doesn't matter. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's only extension. So if you extrapolate it then to the human body and you think about it as labor, then you've basically said, Descartes, you're right. You have the head and I have the body. And your head creates and I'm just being exploited. But what did Marx write about? Extraction of surplus labor. He was realizing the values created by the working person. So anyone who's a true Marxist will realize they have to overturn the Cartesian mechanistic worldview. And the minute you overturn the Cartesian mechanistic worldview, you have a worldview of interaction, interrelationship, relationship. Now you can give it whatever name, you can call it system science, or you can call it spirituality. You can choose the name you want to give to it, but then there's no escape of seeing the world in interconnectedness.
Right. I just wanted to ask you one final question, since this is a sort of global platform and we literally have viewers from actually around the world, a lot from the global north, but also from the global south. What are the sort of contradictions and connections that you see about the whole ecological environmental movement that is going on in the global north? There's a lot going on there, from attacking paintings in Austria and London, sort of middle class activism, to sort of building movements against corporations' extraction of oil, to veganism and organic food and so on in the global north. And then you look at the global south, Africa, South Asia, people are fighting for food security, pollution of their rivers, cities like Delhi have become unlivable and so on. So do you see a lot of contradictions between the two, or do you see there can be more linkages?
Well, I think I've done this work now 4 decades, and this much has happened, that even in the South, there's a very vibrant movement for ecological agriculture. In fact, it's grown from the South to the North. Yeah, what's called organic farming is a name. Organic means related, science of living systems. Mm-hmm. The person who kind of brought it back was Albert Howard, who was sent by the British to improve Indian agriculture. And he arrived and said, the soils are fertile. There's so many insects, but no pest damage. He said, I'm going to make the peasant and the pest my professor. And the book he wrote, called The Agricultural Testament, is what is called the Bible of modern organic farming. But it's basically peasant agriculture of India. And, Mr. Monsanto has been attacking me forever. And they gave me a bullshit award in South Africa. They started to say Vandana Shiva was bringing in imported technology called organic. So I started to organize Harvard lectures to show that organic went from India to the West, and organic is just another name for peasant farming. And if there's anything about the left, it's about peasant farming. Mm-hmm. In India, the left is the peasantry. If you look at what Utsa has done in her amazing work, so it's basically about peasant knowledge, peasant productivity, etc. Wherever there's easy money, that's why for me, Chipko has been a very important teacher. Use your resources to do what you have to maintain your independence. The minute you become too big and you need a lot of money, and right now the money is in the hands of the 1%, and you're so big that only the 1% can support you, you start to have an environmentalism that's corporate environmentalism. It's no more about your relationship with the earth. It's about getting funding to run your machine. And you use words like, veganism, we've had vegetarianism forever. You want to not have meat, eat vegetables. But this new ideology and religion of veganism is basically getting people adjusted to lab food as the next step. There's a very famous environmentalist of England called George Monbiot, who's just now on a rubbish tour. They've created new words, replanet, as if we can make the planet again, We don't replanet. We serve the earth in a better way. And reboot food, reboot food. And I wrote to him, I said, it's not a computer program.
Now Elon Musk has a different program. I mean, it's a different human settlement on Mars.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, what has got us into problem? Artificial fertilizers destroy the atmosphere, the soil, the water. Artificial food, urban ultra-processed food has given us all the chronic diseases. Will going further down that line help us to solve the problem of disease? Will it help us to solve the problem of climate change? So what's happening is, what the big money, Mr. Gates and Silicon Valley decide, they then find a vulnerable environmentalist who doesn't know the context. He doesn't know there are 1,000 ways of doing farming, you know? And they give him 1 year of scholarship to write a book and then make it, you know, make him travel around. And there are enough others who don't use their minds. So these things then become like it's a big trend. But fake food and veganism is an attack on the earth. It's an attack on producers of the earth. And the slogan of farming without farmers and food without farms is a fascist slogan.
Right. All right, then. Thank you so much. I know you're running out of time, but we hope you would come again and we can have much more discuss. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.